Alright, so this week, and next week as well, we're going to be going over some Steven Universe future theories. I have seen variations of these theories bopping around online here and there, so consider these more my take on those particular theories, as well as my own specific interpretation of how the theorized things might happen and or have happened. This week's video is also going to have a little bit of debunking in it, because I've seen a theory going around that while it's interesting, and I think would be definitely a solid theory if one or two details were different, it being presented as it is when those details are not different, I think actually genuinely harms the characterization in this show and has set up an expectation for the lore and the direction of the show, which is derailing the conversations that fans should be having about the themes of the series so far. I don't mean any ill will towards anybody who's been disseminating this theory, which I'll point out when we're getting to it later in the video. But I also don't think it's a theory that people should really be entertaining. And this week, as the title of the video suggests, we're going to be discussing what specifically I think is going to eventually set Steven off in the end. Last Saturday, I talked about the episode's Little Graduation and, specifically for the purposes of this video, Prickly Pear. So if you haven't seen Prickly Pear yet, and you haven't seen my review of it yet, I'd suggest that you at least go watch the episode, and then maybe even go watch my review as well. But I think Prickly Pear did a very good job of reinforcing something that I've been thinking about the show and the direction of the show pretty much since the current season started. One of the most interesting things about Prickly Pear as an episode is that at the end of the episode, as Cactus Steven goes to leave, it leaves behind a cactus flower, which I'm not going to go into specific detail, but cactus flowers are a symbol of maternal love, meaning that the bond between Steven and Cactus Steven was intended to be maternal in some way or another. And I think that makes a lot of sense looking back on the episode, because Steven created Cactus Steven. And so, I think in this specific analogy, Steven is being treated as Cactus Steven's mother, and I think that's specifically to draw a parallel between him and Rose. Like, obviously, Steven is a lot like Rose. We've talked about this a lot. A lot of his good traits are traits that Rose possessed, amplified by the fact that he was raised by Greg, who is a very good person, and simply put, that makes a lot of sense, because going back to the infamous Guide to the Crystal Gems, to that same passage that I cite in like every second theory that I make, we know for a fact that everything that Rose was is now half of Steven. Specifically that all of the information that used to be sourced on her gem has been made part of his genetic structure. And the fact that he can recall memories that she once possessed means that all of the information that used to be part of her being is intact somewhere in there, including her personality. It makes sense that he would have gotten at least half of his personality traits directly from Rose. Not even that he's more predisposed to behaving like her because he shares her genetics, but literally he is pre-programmed to behave like she did. At least half the time, arguably. And this is particularly interesting for several reasons. First of all, Steven still can't stand to listen to people talk about all the horrible stuff that his mom did. And yes, part of that is because he's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He has been dealing with cleaning up her messes for so long now that he is genuinely traumatized by having to clean up her messes and doesn't want to have to deal with it anymore because it triggers that PTSD. But I think another reason why he's been reacting so strongly lately to people bringing up things that Rose has done wrong is because despite his recent revelation as of Change Your Mind that he's Steven, not Rose in a different form, he still feels guilty for the things that she did, because I believe that at the end of her life, Rose felt guilty for all of the horrible things that she had done in her past. I believe that Steven is literally feeling some of her guilt, and just like Rose, bottled up all of that guilt and ignored it specifically by running off to a backwater planet and adopting a completely new identity, I think Steven is trying to bottle all of that up and ignore it. And I think the reason that that's his go-to reaction is because he's predisposed to reacting that way because Rose reacted that way. And I want to be 100% clear about this, and this is where we're getting into debunking another theory very briefly. Rose is gone. She does not exist anymore. Steven has her traits, but that doesn't mean that she's literally a part of him. But at the same time, in a roundabout kind of way, genetically speaking, she also is. And because the gem version of genetics is literal computer programming, I can't help but wonder if maybe Steven has been, in one way or another, pre-programmed. And now, I have seen people suggesting that maybe Steven coming to behave this way as of the start of Steven Universe Future is because he was hit by the Rejuvenator in the movie, and therefore his gem has been reverted to a previous state, which is causing him to behave the way that Rose did back when she was still a young, bratty pink diamond. And the reason I have a problem with that particular theory is because Rose isn't there anymore. It's not her gem anymore. Therefore, it can't be rejuvenated into an earlier version of her. It can only be rejuvenated into an earlier version of Steven, which literally happened in the movie, and then it was literally undone in the movie. He's not rejuvenated anymore. Period. And aside from that, what specifically are we seeing out of Steven's behavior which suggests that he's behaving like a young Rose? Aside from the fact that he's had outbursts, like we know young Rose had outbursts. Something which is explained by the fact that his body is changing, and he's discovering new powers that he never knew he had, and doesn't know how to control them yet, because Rose still would have had to learn to control those powers after she realized how harmful they could be, just like Steven is now having to learn to control those powers. It makes sense that if he's only just now coming into those powers, he wouldn't be able to control them yet. Because what I see when I look at Steven's behavior is exactly what I alluded to earlier. Guilt over the things that Rose had done. If he really is drawing directly upon Rose when he's feeling that way, those are emotions that Rose would have felt towards the end of her life, not towards the beginning of her life, so him feeling that way isn't explained by Rose's gem being rejuvenated into a very early version of Rose's gem. Steven is his own person, he's his own character, he's predisposed towards behaving in specific ways because of who his parents were and how they raised him, or didn't raise him in Rose's case. And he's also a gem, so he may be affected by Rose's programming, which is left over from back when she still existed because she doesn't anymore. But he's not literally turning into Pink Diamond. The solution to him moving past all of this is not going to be something as simple as him just undoing the effects of rejuvenation on his gem. It is a little suspicious that he didn't really seem to have such a strong emotional reaction to being forced to deal with Rose's mistakes as of the time of the movie, compared to how he's reacting to having to deal with Rose's mistakes now. But that can be explained by the progression of time. He was already very clearly reaching a point where he wasn't willing to deal with Rose's shit anymore. It makes sense that that would escalate more as time goes on, and we know that already the show has covered at least a year in time. I do, though, think that Steven is starting to behave more like Rose did. That he is starting to show, more or less, that he has inherited a lot of flaws from Rose, just as he inherited a lot of powers and a lot of other personality positives. And I do think that it's going to be the revelation that he's been treating people like Rose used to treat people that's going to eventually lead to whatever major event happens at the climax of this series. Which brings us back to Prickly Pear. If we look back on how Steven treated Prickly Pear, like, Rose couldn't literally pile a bunch of secrets onto Steven the way that Steven piled a bunch of secrets onto Cactus Steven, using him as a dumping ground for all of his recent insecurities. But she did leave a whole bunch of secrets behind for Steven to wade through as he got older and became more involved in the world that she had once been involved in. And just as all of Steven's secrets started to come out at the absolute worst times during battle with Steven and the other gems, Rose's secrets have come out at very inopportune times and caused real hardship and real pain to Steven and the gems. Like, if you buy into the theory that Rose only had Steven because she knew that creating him and therefore ceasing to exist herself would allow her to dodge the guilt that she was feeling over her past mistakes, you could argue that there's a parallel between that and Steven creating Cactus Steven and all of the other plants specifically to use them to avoid the negative emotions he was feeling as a result of all of his friends going away. Like, there have been moments throughout the course of this series so far which have, to me at least, been very clearly establishing that Steven is way more like his mom than he ever wanted to be. But this is the first episode to be really explicit about it. Which means that Rose, at the end of her life, may have been feeling a lot of the same things that Steven is feeling now. Maybe she was depressed. Maybe she felt like there was nowhere else for her to go, that there was no way for her to improve herself anymore at that point, that her life had stagnated and that would never not be stagnant again. And maybe it was that, and not specifically to dodge the grief that she was feeling over all of her past mistakes, which led her to the decision to end her life by creating Steven. A choice that Steven himself cannot make. Steven cannot make the choice to end his own life in order to create a new, hopefully better life in the process. Which means that Steven may have to solve his own problems, as the premise of the series suggests he's going to have to, by literally working through the angst that Rose was never able to work through herself. And I do think that there's something super poetic about that. He is going to have to become a better version of himself than Rose was ever able to become of herself in order to work through the issues that he's dealing with right now. And one last thing before I sign off for this video. I've seen people saying that they really wish that Connie was around right now because they think she'd be able to get through to Steven and help him to work through this stuff. And maybe that's what's going to happen. Maybe Steven's going to get worse and worse until Connie comes back, and that's when things are going to start to improve. But I don't think that's going to be the case. And honestly, I kind of don't want Connie to come back, because if I'm right and Steven is becoming more and more like Rose, I think he's going to end up hurting someone. The same way that Rose ended up hurting her original Pearl. Maybe not to the same degree, because whatever injury Rose inflicted on her Pearl had to be pretty severe, and gems can withstand more severe injuries than humans can. But I think the person he's going to end up hurting is Connie. I think either it's going to be a very similar situation to what happened with Pink Pearl. He's going to have an outburst of power and physically injure her. Or maybe it'll be something more psychological. Maybe she will come back. Maybe she will be able to see more quickly than anybody else that he's going through some stuff and try to help him work through it. And he's not going to be receptive to that, or he's going to be receptive to that, but then he's going to backslide and he's going to end up hurting her emotionally. But I do think that's going to be what eventually triggers him and causes him to do whatever he ends up doing, which begins the climax of this series. Whether he turns into the worm monster or something else happens or what. And I know some of you are going to say, but AJ, that would never happen. So if you need a direct parallel, then recall this episode here, where a direct parallel is drawn between Connie and Pearl. And it's not the same Pearl, but it's still a Pearl. As well as this book character version of Connie from inside Rose's room, who has an eye patch directly over the same eye that was injured on volleyball. The parallels do exist. So, like, I agree with people saying that Connie's eventual return to the show is going to be a turning point. I just don't feel that the show is going to turn in the direction that they think it's going to. Because, like, Steven cares about a lot of people in the show, right? But I can't think of someone who he cares about more than Connie. I can't think of someone who he cares about as much as it was implied that Rose cared about her first pearl, except for Connie. If the inciting incident which leads to Steven really losing his shit really has to do with him being a parallel to Pink Diamond in one way or another, I do think he's going to in some way harm Connie. And I don't want to see that, and I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that what ends up happening is something more along the lines of he reaches a point where he realizes that if he had taken things just a little bit further, he would have harmed her, and that's what sets him off and triggers everything else. But still, I do think that she's going to in some way be involved in the inciting incident, and also probably bringing him back down from whatever that incident incites. All of that said, what did you guys think of any of the ideas put forth in this messy hodgepodge of half-formed, barely related theory ideas? Do you like the idea that Steven is being set up as a parallel for Rose, someone who will have to overcome the faults within himself that Rose was never able to overcome in herself in order to work through the problems he's facing now? Or do you think I'm just totally off and that's not where the show is going at all? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later.